The spoon came at her out of the candle dark, and Lady Rosalind Hawkmere opened her mouth for it the way a clockwork doll opens, on a hinge, on command. Mr. Silas Coyle leaned over the bed with the pewter spoon held level, the gray tonic trembling in its bowl like something half alive, and his thumb pressed her chin down with the bored familiarity of a man performing a chore he had performed 1,000 nights. "There's the good creature," he murmured, the way one speaks to a horse that has stopped fighting the bit. The tonic touched her tongue, bitter and chalk-cold, smelling of poppy, and something underneath the poppy that no honest apothecary would name. Rosalind let her gray-green eyes go flat and far, fixed on the bed curtain's mildewed fold, as though she were watching a ship sink very slowly on the horizon of it. She did not swallow. She had not swallowed a drop in 3 weeks. With a patience she had drilled until it was as natural as breath, she let the cold thread of it run from the corner of her mouth, down the hollow of her jaw, and away into the long frayed sleeve of her unbleached muslin gown, where the cloth drank it and told no one. From the doorway, Lady Drusilla Hawkmere watched, beautiful in dove-gray silk that did not belong in this damp-barred room, and she turned her lovely head to the young man at her shoulder, a visiting magistrate's clerk, pink-eared and uneasy, and said in a voice pitched low for sympathy and clear for carrying, "The poor creature has not known her own name in a 12-month. We tried everything. London men, water cures, prayer, there is nothing left but kindness and the tonic that gives her sleep." The clerk made the sound men make when they wish to be elsewhere, and Rosalind, vacant on command, drool of laudanum darkening her cuff, lay perfectly still and counted. She had been counting for 2 years. There were no tears in her, and no protest, and no plea, only a stillness that the household had long ago decided was the stillness of an empty house, when in truth it was the stillness of a woman counting days and pricing every face in the room, and waiting. They thought her gone. They did not know that she watched them the way a cat watches a curtain twitch, and in the locked rosewood chest at the foot of her bed, the one thing in all of Saltmere they let her keep, because what harm could a music box do a madwoman, sat the lark box, the betrothal box, which she never once let them see her touch, and which held, beneath a floor they did not know was false, everything she would need to bury them. If you have ever sat at a bedside and looked into the eyes of someone the whole world had agreed to give up on, a mother, a sister, a friend gone strange and silent, and felt that small treasonous flicker that whispered, "But what if they are still in there, what if they hear every word," then you already understand Rosalind Hawkmere better than the people who had her in their keeping ever would. This is a story about a woman buried alive in the appearance of her own ruin, and about the long, quiet, unhurried work of digging out. It does not raise its voice. Neither did she. If that is the kind of story that holds you, the slow patient kind, where the wrong do not scream, but simply, eventually, become impossible to deny, then settle in, and stay with her to the end, because the end is the only part that the people in this room deserve to be afraid of. And if somewhere along the way, Rosalind earns your faith, lend her a moment of yours, let this story know you are listening, the way Nan Pryor let her know, the way no one else in Saltmere would. Now, back 2 years, to the place where the theft began, because to understand how a sane woman comes to lie drooling for a magistrate's clerk, you must first understand everything she had to lose. She had not always been the madwoman of Saltmere. There had been a girl, and the girl had been Hawkmere itself, sole heir of an old, land-rich, cash-poor name, after the river fever took first her mother, and then, by slow inches, her father. Rosalind had nursed Lord Hawkmere through that last grey winter herself, had learned the smell of a sick room and the weight of a man's failing hand in hers, and had stood at his grave dry-eyed at 22, with the whole estate settling onto her shoulders like a coat cut for a larger person. She had not flinched from it. She had a steward's head for accounts, and a long memory for tenants' names, and a way of being in a room that made older men forget to condescend to her. The county had expected her to marry quickly and hand the burden to a husband. The county had not reckoned on whom she meant to marry. For there had been, in those days, Adrian, Duke Adrian Vaughancy, though the title sat strangely on him. A younger son made heir by his elder brother's death, a man who had spent his youth not at cards, but at lectures, who had walked the wards of hospitals when he might have walked the floors of ballrooms, and who had earned, by the time he was 30, a reputation as the most exacting and humane physician of mind and nerve that England had lately produced. They had met over a sick-bed. Naturally, he had come to consult on her dying father, and had stayed 3 days past his fee because he found, in the grave gray-eyed daughter, a mind that met his own without flinching. He had asked her opinion of the case, as an equal. No man had ever done that. She had given it. He had agreed. And somewhere between the consultation and the burial, without either of them quite deciding to, they had fallen into the rarest sort of love, the kind built not on a glance across a room but on 100 unhurried conversations, on argument and agreement, on the discovery that the other person was the only one who had ever made the world less lonely. He had given her, at their betrothal, a small thing he had chosen himself, rather than sent a man to buy, a music box of dark rosewood, inlaid with a tiny lark of mother of pearl on the lid, that played, when wound, the rising song of a lark climbing out of a morning field. "Because you are forever telling me there is a good day coming," he had said. "And I should like you to have the sound of one in your hand, for the days that aren't." She had kept the lark box on her writing desk, then by her bed, and at last had carried it with her into exile, the single thread that still tied the woman in the barred room to the woman she had been. And then, the decline. That was the word the household had settled upon, said in hushed rooms with grave faces. The decline, as if it were a weather that had simply come over her, unaccountable, and no one's fault. It had begun the same season her brother brought home a wife. Lord Edmund Hawkmere, younger than Rosalind, gentler, weaker, a man who grieved their father by drinking and weeping rather than by working, had gone up to town a bachelor, and come back married to a creature called Drusilla, the dazzling daughter of a sugar fortune that had no name to go with it and badly wanted one. Drusilla had walked into Hawkmere Court and looked at its faded grandeur and its sole female heir, the way a clever buyer looks at an underpriced house with a sitting tenant. Within a month of the new lady's arrival, Rosalind had begun to be unwell. Headaches first, then a strange gray heaviness behind the eyes, nights of dreams that bled into waking, a trembling in her cold hands she could not still, hours she could not afterward account for. Mr. Coyle, Drusilla's man, the apothecary steward she had brought down from town, a soft-spoken person with ink-stained fingers and a dosing ledger he carried like a prayer book, had been ever so attentive. He compounded a tonic for her nerves. It helped her sleep, he said. It did not. It only made the days grayer and the trembling worse, and made Rosalind, who knew her own body the way she knew her own accounts, begin, slowly, through the fog, to do a terrible sum. She was sickest on the mornings after the tonic. She was clearest on the rare nights she contrived to spill it. No fever attended her illness. No honest disease ran the course this thing was running, and the more her wits guttered, the more freely Drusilla wept to visitors about the tragedy of it, and the more papers Lord Edmund signed without reading, and the further from the management of her own estate Rosalind found herself drifting. Until one wet October the carriage came and she was taken, gently, oh so gently, for her own good, to Saltmere, the wind-scoured dower house above the grey cliffs, half sick-room and half gaol, where mad and inconvenient women had always been sent to be forgotten, and the engagement, her one bright thread, her Adrian, had been declared broken in the same breath, dissolved by her decline. An arrangement no longer possible given the lady's tragic state. She had written to him. She had written and written, in the early months, before the fog grew thick, letters smuggled out with the laundry and the coal, pages on which she had poured everything she dared, and a great deal she had no right to expect a man to answer, that she was being made ill, that she did not understand by what means, that she did not believe she was losing her reason, but feared she might if no one came, that if he had ever meant a word of it, he should come now, and look at her with his physician's eyes, and tell her whether she was mad. She had sealed each one with a hope she was ashamed of, and sent it out into the wet dark of the Saltmere yard. He had never answered one. Not a line, not a word by a servant, not so much as a cold formal note dissolving what was already declared, dissolved. And so, in the absence of any answer, she had built the only explanation a proud woman could bear to build, that he had read of her decline, or heard of it from the same mouths that wept it to the county, and had done the sensible thing, the thing his rank and his reputation required, and quietly let her go. That the cleverest, kindest man she had ever known had weighed a ruined betrothed against his good name and chosen his name. It was, she had decided, no more than she should have expected. Love was a luxury and she was no longer a fit object for it. And so, she had let herself believe the cruelest thing of all, that he, like everyone, had looked at what she was becoming and turned away. She had folded that belief small and swallowed it where the tonic could not reach, and it had sat in her like a stone ever since. She was wrong about that, but she did not yet know she was wrong, and the not knowing was a wound she carried under all the others. Worse than the cold and the bars, what the household never reckoned with, what Drusilla, for all her cleverness, could not see, because she had never once looked at Rosalind as a person, rather than an obstacle, was that somewhere in that long gray drowning, the woman had begun to surface. The clearing came in inches, on the nights she managed not to swallow. And with the clearing came a cold and patient fury, that she was far too wise to ever let show. So she had learned to act. She wore the vacancy like the muslin gown they gave her, loose and shapeless and convincing. She let her auburn hair hang unpinned at the temples, and her eyes drift, and her hands lie chilled and trembling in her lap. She answered to nothing and remembered everything. And she was not unkind, in her confinement, though kindness was the last thing anyone there expected from a creature they had agreed was empty. There was Nan Pryor, the sharp-tongued kitchen girl of perhaps 15, all elbows and suspicion, who had been set to carry up the trays and had expected to hate the spoiled lady from the great house. Instead she had found a woman who thanked her, who asked her name and remembered it, who once, on a clear night, had murmured, without moving her lips much, "The tea they send up is laced, Nan, the plain pot in the scullery is not. I should be very grateful for the plain pot, and very quiet about it." And Nan, who had a quick wit and an old grudge against Mr. Coyle for the way his eyes followed the maids, had said nothing and brought the plain pot, and so a conspiracy of two had been born over a chipped teacup, and Rosalind had gained her first ally and her first clear mornings. And there was Mrs. Verrall, in the next barred room along the damp corridor, who was the genuine article, truly, sadly mad, lost in the wreck of some old grief, who spoke to a son 40 years dead, and wept at shadows, and sometimes, in the night, sang. Rosalind was gentle with her past all reason. She would sit at the shared wall when the house slept, and talk her down from her terrors in that low exact voice, and on Mrs. Verrall's rare lucid hours, when the poor woman would clutch her hand and say, "You're not like me, dearie, your eyes are home." "I can see they're home," Rosalind would only smile and hush her, because the difference between them was the whole of her secret and the whole of her hope. For Mrs. Verrall was what Drusilla swore Rosalind to be. And Rosalind, listening to the genuine darkness through the wall each night, understood with perfect clarity exactly what they were trying to make of her, and exactly how far she still had to go, and how carefully, before the day came when she would be allowed, at last, to speak. The visits began with the first hard frost, when the county grew dull, and a madwoman became, for the idle ladies of the neighborhood, a kind of entertainment that could be enjoyed without scandal, because it was framed as charity. Drusilla had a gift for framing. She would arrive at Saltmere in a fresh gown and a freshly composed sorrow, 2 or 3 county wives trailing behind her with their smelling salts and their delicious dread, and lead them down the damp corridor the way a keeper leads paying visitors through a menagerie. She was the cleverest girl in 3 counties, once, she would say at the door of the barred east room, her voice trembling with exactly the right grief. "It breaks my heart to bring you, but I think it right her old friends should see how she is used, that none may say, we hid her, or were anything but tender." And then the door would open, and the ladies would file in to look at what had become of Lady Rosalind Hawkmere. Rosalind gave them what they came for. She had learned the art of it past any actress. She let her gray-green eyes swim and settle on nothing, her auburn hair straggle loose at the temples, her cold hands pluck without purpose at the frayed hem of her muslin sleeve, and when one of the braver wives bent close and said, slow and loud as one speaks to the deaf, "Do you know me, Lady Rosalind? It is Cecilia Marsh. We danced together at the assembly." Rosalind only turned her face to the gray window and watched the gulls fall down the wind, as though the woman were a drought she had felt and forgotten. She heard every word. She priced every face. She marked which flinched with pity, and which leaned in with appetite, and filed the appetite away under names, because a day was coming when she would need to know exactly who had come to Gaup. The ladies left shaken and satisfied, murmuring of poor Drusilla's saintly patience all the way down the cliff road, and Rosalind added the visit to her count. They thought they had looked at an empty house. They had not noticed that the house was taking inventory of them. It was Drusilla herself who unwittingly handed Rosalind the next plank of her scaffold. The sister-in-law had grown, over the autumn, faintly impatient, not with the cruelty of the thing, which never troubled her, but with its slowness. There was a question of law, which Rosalind understood at first only in fragments, gleaned from the careless talk of people who spoke freely before furniture. The estate could not pass fully into Drusilla's keeping while its heir merely languished. A languishing heir might, in the eyes of some tiresome chancery clerk, recover. What Drusilla wanted was finality, an heir not merely confined, but legally erased, declared by competent authority to be of unsound mind, her person and her lands handed into guardianship, sealed beyond any rising. And for that, the certificate Mr. Coyle had so obligingly drawn up was no longer thought enough. The county had grown nice about such things, since a scandal 2 shires over, where a sane man buried alive by greedy cousins had got out and made an embarrassment of everybody. Now they wanted a hearing, a commission of magistrates, and above all, to set their seal upon it, the opinion of some great independent physician of the mind, a man of unimpeachable name, whom no one could later accuse of being bought. And I have found him, Drusilla announced one gray forenoon, sweeping into the room with the news held out before her like a trophy, addressing it half to Coyle and half to the heir, in the manner of a woman who has stopped believing her sister-in-law can hear. The most celebrated mad doctor in England has consented to examine her and sign. When the Duke himself has set his hand to it, let any chancery clerk in the kingdom try to unpick it. She laughed, low and pleased. We shall have it finished before the new year, and a happy Christmas to us all. A duke. The most celebrated mad doctor in England. Rosalind, lying vacant against her bolster with her gaze fixed on the middle distance, felt the words go into her like a splinter of ice, and gave no sign at all, not a flicker of the lashes, not a change in the slow false rhythm of her breath, though something underneath her stillness had gone very cold and very loud. There were 100 celebrated physicians of the mind in England. It need not be him. She forbade herself the name even in the privacy of her own skull, because hope was the one luxury she could not afford to be caught with, and she went back to her counting and let the splinter melt where it lay. But Drusilla, having found her instrument, could not resist tuning it, and the tuning was a goad. She had decided that the Duke must find the patient floridly, unmistakably deranged, no quiet vacant creature that a clever man might mistake for merely broken, but a raving one, a textbook one, a woman whose madness wrote itself plain. And so she set about, in the days that followed, to provoke it. She came alone now, in the evenings, with Coyle at her shoulder and the dosing ledger open, and practiced cruelties calibrated to break a sane woman's composure where mere confinement had not. She spoke of Hawkmere, the dripping ceiling in the long gallery let go to ruin, the tenants turned off, Rosalind's mother's garden grubbed up for a fashionable lawn, watching all the while for the wince that would prove the wits beneath. She brought a letter one night in Rosalind's own girlish hand, some forgotten note to a school friend, and read it aloud in a cooing, mocking sing-song, then held it to the candle and let it burn between her fingers. "Nothing in there now, is there, my dear?" she murmured. "Nothing left to write with." And on the worst night she leaned close and said, soft as a lover, things about Adrian, that he had said he was well rid of the mad Hawkmere chit, that he was to marry a sound healthy girl in the spring, that he had laughed about his narrow escape over his port. They were lies, invented on the spot for the pleasure of the wound, but Rosalind could not know they were lies, and that was the night the woman beneath the mask came nearest to drowning. She felt the old stone in her chest crack, and the long-damned fury and sorrow surged toward her throat, and she very nearly, by a hair, by a single drawn breath, broke. She wanted to stand. She wanted to say in her own low exact voice that she was not mad, had never been mad, that they had poisoned her and they would hang. The sentence stood whole, and ready behind her teeth where it had stood for 2 years. And she did not say it, because she understood, with the cold clarity the clearing nights had given her, that to say it here, now, to these two, with no witness but a kitchen girl and a madwoman through the wall, was to throw away everything. They would smile, write it in the ledger as a paroxysm, double the dose, and show the Duke a screaming creature as proof. The only place her sentence could do its work was a place with the whole county in it, the magistrates, the gentry, the great independent physician himself, all looking, and she meant to keep it whole until she stood in that room. So she let the fury go out through her eyes as vacancy, let a thin line of spit run from the corner of her mouth, and rocked a little, and hummed, and Drusilla, disappointed, decided the creature was too far gone even to be goaded properly, and swept out, and Rosalind lay in the dark and shook, not with madness, but with the violence of everything she had just refused to do. Then she went back to work, because the goading had taught her how little time was left, and the work was the only prayer she had. It had a shape now, and a confederate, and a hiding place. Each night, after the spoon had come and gone and the cold thread of grey tonic had run away into her sleeve, Rosalind waited until the house had settled into its damp creaking sleep. Then rose in the dark and did the patient business of her own salvation. The lark box came first. She would lift it from the foot of the bed, the rosewood betrothal box with its mother-of-pearl bird, the one thing they let her keep, because what harm could a music box do a madwoman, and with fingers grown sure in the dark press the inlay just so, and ease up the floor they did not know was false. Beneath it lay her armory. There was a small stoppered vial, and into this, drop by careful drop wrung from the soaked cuff of her gown before the cloth could dry, she decanted the night's dose, so that night by night the vial filled with the very poison meant to drown her, kept now as the proof that would damn them. And there was the slate that kept her safe while she did it, through Nan Pryor, who carried up the trays, and hated Mr. Coyle with a clean 15-year-old hatred. A second bottle moved in secret, plain gray-tinted water, harmless as rain, mixed to the color of the tonic in the scullery, by candlelight. When Coyle's back was turned and the dosing done, it was this innocent water that sometimes sat in the place of the real tincture in his case. So that even on the nights Rosalind could not safely spill, she swallowed nothing that could hurt her, and her mind cleared further, and her keepers suspected nothing at all. And there was the boldest theft of the three. Coyle kept his ledger like a prayer book, every dose entered in his cramped hand, against the date, a faithful, fatal record, in his own writing, of a poisoning dressed as a cure. It never left him by day. But Coyle drank, and on the nights he drank he slept heavy in the still-room, with the ledger on the bench, and on one such night Nan, who could move through Saltmere like a drought, eased a single loose leaf from the back of the book, where a fresh quire had not yet been sewn tight, one page, dense with dates and quantities. The dose climbing in step with every legal step Drusilla took toward the estate. The page came up to Rosalind under a folded napkin with the plain tea, and went down into the false floor of the lark box beside the vial, and the box closed over it, with a small wooden click that was, to the only sane ear in Saltmere, the sweetest sound she had heard in 2 years. Letter, vial, ledger leaf, the original and the swap and the proof. She had only to keep breathing, and keep counting, and keep her one sentence whole, until the room came to her. What Rosalind could not see, what would have eased the one wound she could not dress, had she only known it, was that the man she had taught herself to despise had never been given the chance to fail her. The letters she had poured out in those early months, the smuggled pages in which she had begged Adrian to come and look at her with his physician's eyes and tell her whether she was mad, had never crossed the county. They had gone out into the wet Saltmere yard in the coal and the laundry, as she believed, but they had come, every one, into Drusilla's white hands. Drusilla had sat by her own fire, and read a frightened, lucid, unmistakably sane woman pleading for rescue, had understood at once how dangerous that handwriting was, and had fed each page to the flames, with the same small pleasure she would later take in burning the schoolgirl note. Not one had reached the Duke. And to make the silence safe, Drusilla had taken a further care, a single forged line, in a hand approximating Rosalind's, sent on to Adrian in the early days through a discreet intermediary, releasing him from the engagement, begging him for both their sakes to make no reply and attempt no visit, signed with a brittle dignity meant to wound a proud man into honoring it. And it had. Adrian Vauncey, who had not chosen his name over the woman he loved, who would have ridden through a December night to her bedside had he believed for 1 hour that she wanted him, had received what he took to be her own cold dismissal, and had honored it the way an honorable man honors the wishes of a woman who no longer wants him, by staying away and grieving in private, never knowing the grief was a lie someone else had written for him. Drusilla, even now, was not entirely easy in her cleverness. She had chosen the most independent physician in England, precisely because his name could not be bought or doubted, and the very thoroughness she was buying had begun, in her quieter hours, to trouble her. A bought man examines a patient for an afternoon, and signs. A great man might look. She told herself the creature was too far gone to be anything but what it seemed, poured herself another glass, and did not let herself finish the thought. The carriage came on a wild evening at the end of the year, the wind off the grey sea flinging rain at Saltmere's blind windows, and the gulls driven inland to scream along the cliff. Rosalind heard the wheels before anything else, the change in the house, the running feet, Drusilla's voice gone suddenly bright and high in the hall below, Coil's heavier tread, candles carried past her door in a hurry they had never shown for her. She rose without a sound and went to the barred east window and looked down through the streaming glass into the torch-lit yard, where a traveling carriage stood steaming in the rain, and a man was climbing down from it. He turned his collar up against the weather and lifted his face for one moment toward the dark bulk of the house, toward the very window where she stood unseen behind the bars, and the torchlight fell full upon it. Rosalind's breath stopped in her throat. 2 years she had forbidden herself the name, folded the hope small and swallowed it where the tonic could not reach, and now it rose in her all at once, undamned and enormous and terrifying, because there was no mistaking the grave lean line of that face, the particular tilt of the head she had argued with across 100 sick-room evenings. The man who had once put a lark into her hand so she would have the sound of a good day for the days that weren't. It was Adrian. They had summoned her Adrian to come and declare her mad, and he had come up the cliff road in the rain not knowing, could not possibly know, that the ruined nameless creature he had been called to seal away forever was the betrothed he had mourned. She pressed her cold hand flat against the bars, and did not weep and did not cry out. She only stood and watched him go in out of the rain beneath her, and understood that the room she had waited 2 years for had, at last, begun to gather itself around her. They brought her to Hawkmere Court in a closed carriage, with the blinds drawn, as though daylight itself might disorder her. And when the door opened upon the gravel sweep of her own family's house, Rosalind stepped down with her hands folded and her gray-green eyes lowered, and let them believe she did not know where she was. She knew. She had been born in the East Wing, whose windows looked down on her now. The smell of the place, beeswax and coal smoke and cold stone, went into her like a blade turned slowly, and she let none of it reach her face. 2 years they had told the county she could not recognize her own name. She would not spend the dignity she had hoarded so carefully on a flinch in a courtyard. She walked between her keepers with the unlearnable posture of the highborn, her unbleached muslin frayed at the hem, her deep auburn hair loose at the temples. And she counted her steps to the door the way she had counted her days, because counting was the discipline that had kept her sane, while they swore she was not. Inside, the great hall had been made over into a courtroom. They had set a long table on the dais beneath the Hawkmere arms, and behind it sat Sir Hubert Galt, the magistrate, broad and florid and pleased with the gravity of his office, flanked by 2 lesser justices and a clerk. The county had come to watch. The gentry filled the benches in their good wool and their curiosity, and among them Rosalind saw faces she had danced with once, faces that now studied her as one studies an animal at a fair, with that particular mixture of pity and appetite that is the cruelty of the comfortable. She let her gaze pass over them without weight. Near the front, in dove-gray silk that had cost more than Nan Pryor would earn in 5 years, sat Lady Drusilla Hawkmere, serene as a saint in a window, her gloved hands at rest, her beautiful new money face arranged into exactly the right measure of grief. Beside her, hunched and gray and unable to meet anyone's eye, sat Rosalind's brother. Lord Edmund, wretched, half blind to nothing now, a man drowning slowly in a guilt he had not yet found the courage to name. And at the table's end, with his ledger and his quills and his small precise hands folded over a leather case, sat Mr. Silas Coyle, the apothecary steward, who had spooned the grey tonic into her mouth every night for 2 years and written the dose in his book each morning, with the satisfaction of a man balancing accounts. Coyle was confident. Rosalind saw it in the set of his shoulders. He held the ledger, he held the certificate, he had, he believed, broken her mind so thoroughly that whatever she said today would only seal the verdict. He did not know that the grey tincture in the lark box's hidden vial was his own poison, and not water, decanted night after night by a kitchen girl's quick hands. He did not know that she had not swallowed a drop in 3 weeks. He did not know that the fog he saw in her eyes was a performance she could end whenever she chose. None of them knew. That was the whole of her wealth, that they were all of them certain, and certainty is the easiest thing in the world to overturn, if a woman has the patience to let her enemies build it tall. Sir Hubert cleared his throat and the hall fell quiet. He spoke of the solemn duty of the commission, of the law's tender care for those who could not care for themselves, of the necessity, before so grave a thing as a committal, of an examination by a physician of unimpeachable distinction. And then he named the physician, and the doors at the back of the hall opened, and Duke Adrian Vauncey came down the long aisle between the benches, and Rosalind, who had taught herself 2 years ago to feel nothing she did not choose to feel, felt her heart strike once against her ribs like a fist on a locked door. He was older. There was grey at his temples that had not been there when he had put the betrothal ring on her finger and the lark box into her hands and called her, lo, the only sane thing in a mad world. He carried himself with the gravity of the celebrated man he had become, the physician nobleman whose name was spoken in London with reverence. He did not look at her as he came. He looked at the magistrate, at the table, at the papers laid ready for his signature, because to him she was only the patient, the asylum bride, the deranged woman of Saltmere he had been summoned across 2 counties to certify, and he did not yet know, could not yet know, that the woman they had dressed in frayed muslin and seated in the chair of the accused was the betrothed he had mourned, the woman he believed had broken his heart and his engagement in the ruin of her own mind. For Drusilla had been thorough. She had intercepted the letters Rosalind wrote him in the first weeks of her confinement, the letters that screamed she was not mad, that begged him to come, had burned them in the still-room grate, and let Adrian believe that poor Rosalind in her decline had cast him off, had become a stranger to her own affections. He had grieved her, as the living grieve the lost. And the cruelest stroke of Drusilla's whole long cruelty was this: she had summoned him here on purpose, the most eminent mad doctor in England. Certain his expert hand on the final certificate would silence any doubt the county might harbor forever, never dreaming that the man she had chosen to bury Rosalind was the one man on earth who had once known every line of her face by heart. "Bring the patient forward," said Sir Hubert. They led her to the chair set apart before the dice. Rosalind sat, hands folded, eyes downcast, and let her breathing go shallow and her face go slack. The old fog, the practiced vacancy, the look of a woman who has been told so often that she is not there, that she has agreed at last to vanish. Adrian approached with his case. He drew up a low stool before her with the brisk impersonal courtesy of his profession, and began. And his voice as he spoke the first formal questions was kind in the way a good physician is kind to a stranger, distant and gentle, and it nearly undid her, that kindness, because it was the same voice, and it did not know her. "Can you tell me your name?" She let a silence stretch. She had planned every beat of this. Not yet. Let him work. Let him be the great physician and find what the great physician was trained to find, because the proof she had hoarded would mean nothing if she flung it down before the room was ready, and everything if she made them watch a clever man arrive at the truth one step ahead of her. He took her wrist to count the pulse, and she felt the instant it began, the small change in him, the stillness that came into his hands. Her hands were cold, they were always cold now, the laudanum-dosed tonics having left her fingers chilled with a deep marrow cold that no fire reached. He noted it. A physician notes everything. He turned her hand and looked at the bluish beds of her nails, and she saw the faintest crease come between his brows. Then he lifted her chin with 2 fingers, gently, to look at her eyes in the light from the high windows, and Rosalind, who had meant to keep them fogged a moment longer, made the one choice she had not planned. She let him see. For half a heartbeat, no more, she lifted the veil she had worn for 2 years and let her gray-green eyes meet his fully, clear and exact and entirely present. The eyes of the woman he had loved, and she watched the recognition go through Adrian Vauncey like a current through water. He did not gasp. He did not speak her name. Whatever it cost him, and she saw what it cost him, saw the color leave his face and the breath stop in his chest, he held it, the way she had held the courtyard. Because he understood in that single suspended instant that they were both of them surrounded, and that the only weapon either of them had was the room's belief that nothing had happened. His thumb pressed once against her cold wrist, a pressure that was not the physician's at all. "I know you." And then he turned back to his case as though to fetch an instrument. And his hands were not quite steady, and only Rosalind saw it. But the physician had not stopped working even as the man reeled. He looked again at her eyes, and this time not for madness, he looked at the pupils, pinpoint, fixed, contracted to black dots no larger than a pin's head even here in the dim hall where they ought to have stood wide. The chilled hands, the bluish nails, the blue cast to her lips, the dryness of her mouth, the way her stillness was not the restless distraction of true derangement, but the leaden quiet of a body under a heavy and continual dose. He had certified the mad for 15 years. He knew the look of a deranged mind. This was not it. This was the look of a woman being poisoned, slowly, daily, with something that wore the mask of insanity over the face of a tincture. And the certainty arrived in him whole, the way it had arrived in her enemies, except that his was true. He stood. He turned to the table, and his voice when it came was the level public voice of the great physician, and it carried to the last bench. "Before I can certify this patient," Adrian said, "I must ask the commission a question. By what means, and on whose order, and for how long, has this woman been physicked? I observe in her every sign of a body under a continual narcotic dose. I will not put my name to a verdict of madness over what may be the work of an apothecary's spoon." The hall stirred. Sir Hubert frowned. And Lady Drusilla's serene face did not so much as flicker, but Rosalind, who had spent 2 years learning to read the smallest weather of that face, saw the gloved hands tighten by a fraction in the dove-gray lap, and knew the long patient work was about to come down. She rose. She rose without haste, and the room turned to her, and she let the fog fall away entirely now. Let her spine go straight, and her chin lift and her voice come low and exact and unhurried, the voice of a woman who has had 2 years to plan one sentence and means to spend it well. "Permit me," said Lady Rosalind Hawkmere, "to answer the physician, since the matter concerns my own person, of which I am told I have not been mistress for a 12-month. And into the absolute silence that followed she walked, unhindered, to the long table, and set upon it the rosewood music box she had never once let them take from her, the Hawkmere lark box, Adrian's own betrothal gift, that played a lark's song, and with her cold steady fingers she pressed the carved lark on its lid, and turned the hidden catch, and lifted the false bottom that no gaoler in 2 years had ever found. She laid 2 things on the green baize before Sir Hubert Galt. The first was a letter, folded and worn soft at the creases. "This," she said, "is the physician's letter written upon my examination 2 years past, declaring me of perfectly sound mind. It is in the hand of the physician who examined me then." She looked, for the first time openly, at Adrian. "It is in your hand, your grace. You wrote it, I have kept the original." She turned then to the clerk's table, where the certificate of lunacy lay ready for the great physician's confirming signature, and she said, "Compare it, sir, with the certificate before you, the same hand in its body, the same phrases, only the verdict reversed and the date altered, recopied, and redated by another. After the fact, to make a sound woman mad. The forgery is built upon the truth, that is why it has held so long." Adrian took up both papers. The hall held its breath, while the great physician read his own words twice over, once as he had written them, of sound and excellent mind, and once as they had been turned against the woman he had written them for. His jaw set. "This is my hand," he said, very low, to the magistrate. "And this, the certificate, is my hand counterfeited, and the date is false. I wrote no certificate of lunacy. I was never asked to. I was told only that the lady had ended our engagement in her decline. He looked at Drusilla then, full on, and the look was terrible. The second thing on the baize was a small stoppered vial of grey liquid. "And this," said Rosalind, "is the tonic I have been given every night for 2 years, by Mr. Coyle, by his own hand and his mistress's order. I have not swallowed it in 3 weeks. I have saved it. I would be glad to have it tested before this commission, sir, against the contents of Mr. Coyle's bottles and the doses written in Mr. Coyle's ledger, which I am told begins, if you will trouble to look, in the very week my father died and I became sole heir of Hawkmere. A madness that waited so politely for an inheritance is a rare madness indeed." Sir Hubert, pompous and honest both, looked from the vial to the ledger Coyle had brought to damn her, and his honesty did the rest. He called for the apothecary's case to be opened, and a measure of the tonic drawn off and tested then and there, before the county, by the commission's own physician and Adrian together, silver to it, and a few drops of the reagent Adrian carried in his case for exactly such work. The hall pressed forward. Drusilla sat without moving, her face a perfect mask, and Coyle had begun, very faintly, to sweat. The clear grey liquid was decanted into a glass, the reagent was let fall. Adrian stirred it once with a glass rod and held it up to the window light for the whole hall to see. The tonic turned black. It went from grey to a deep and unmistakable black in the space of 3 heartbeats, the color of metal and corruption. The color of the thing they had been pouring into her night after night, while they swore to the county it was a kindness. A sound went through the gentry on the benches like wine through standing corn. Adrian set the glass down upon the table, very gently, as a man sets down something he does not trust himself to hold. And into the ringing silence he said the words that turned the whole long lie inside out, said them not as her physician, and not yet as the man who had never stopped loving her, but as a witness before the law. This woman was never mad. She was poisoned. The black that had bloomed in the little glass dish did not fade. It sat on the commission table, dark as a drop of ink in milk. And no man in Hawkmere Court's great hall could pretend he had not seen it. Sir Hubert Galt looked at it a long moment over the rims of his spectacles, then looked at Mr. Silas Coyle, and the silence grew so complete that the wind off the cliffs could be heard worrying at the leaded windows, the same grey wind that had scoured Saltmere for 2 years, while the world agreed the woman in the barred room had lost her mind. Rosalind did not look at the dish. She had watched it do the same by candlelight in her cell a dozen times, learning the color of her own poisoning by heart, so that when this hour came she would not flinch and give them the satisfaction of her surprise. She looked instead at Coyle, and waited, because a cornered man does not need to be pushed, he needs only to be left alone with the thing he has done until it turns and looks back at him. Coyle was sweating through his good coat, his eyes flicking from the blackened dish to the redated certificate to the leaf torn from his own dosing ledger that Tom Vauncey had carried in from the still-room not a quarter hour before. He understood, as a man of figures understands a column that will not balance, that there was no arrangement of these papers that did not end with him. And careful men, when the trap shuts, think first of their own skin. "I am a tradesman," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "A tradesman who mixed what he was bid to mix, and wrote what he was bid to write. I kept the ledger because I was told to keep it, against the day it should be needed, and I was promised." He stopped himself, but too late. The room had heard the shape of the sentence, the promise, the someone who promises. "Promised by whom, Mr. Coyle?" said Sir Hubert, very quietly, and it was the quiet of a magistrate who has presided over 100 such collapses and knows the precise weight of the next word. Coyle's gaze went, helplessly, the way a compass needle goes, to the seat where Lady Drusilla Hawkmere sat in her bottle-green silk, with her gloved hands folded, beautiful and composed and white now to the lips. And in that single involuntary glance the whole hall turned with him, every magistrate and squire and gawping county lady, who had come to feast on mad Rosalind swinging now toward Drusilla like iron filings, and Rosalind watched her sister-in-law's lovely face understand that the room had changed owners. "Lady Drusilla," Coyle said. The name came out of him in a rush, a drowning man's lunge for the only spar in reach, and once it was out the rest came tumbling after. It was Lady Drusilla's design from the first. The tincture was her commission, a thing to mimic the wandering wits, dosed small and steady so the decline should look like God's own work and no man's. She had me recopy the Duke's letter and alter the date and the finding, and keep the count of the drops. She intercepted the lady's correspondence these 2 years and burned it in the still-room grate, the letters to his grace among them, so the Duke should think himself jilted and stay away. I set it all down, gentlemen, for I am not a fool, whatever else I am. He was weeping now, wholly for himself, and Rosalind watched it without pleasure and without mercy, for there was nothing in Silas Coyle to pity, and she had long since spent what little she might have had. Drusilla rose. She did not faint or shriek, but came to her feet in her green silk, with her chin level, and tried, in the voice that had governed Saltmere and charmed half the county, to seize the room back by main force. "This is a servant's slander," she said, "a poisoner naming his betters to save his neck, and you will none of you be so green as to credit." But her voice, which had always been her instrument, betrayed her now. It climbed, it thinned, it reached for the cold authority that had broken Rosalind 100 times and found only air. Because the certificate lay on the table in Adrian Vauncey's own hand, redated in hers, and the ledger lay open in Coyle's, and the dish of poison sat black between them, and against those 3 quiet witnesses a beautiful woman's furious voice was nothing at all. The county had come to see a mad woman rave. It was watching the wrong woman lose her composure, and it knew it. Through all of it Rosalind had said nothing. She let the evidence speak, and the evidence was unanswerable, and Drusilla's rising voice only dug the grave the deeper. It was Sir Hubert who ended it, rapping the table once with the flat of his hand. "Sit down, madam," he said, "or be made to," and Drusilla, after one terrible suspended instant, sat. Then the magistrate did the thing the whole long room had been built toward. He gathered the papers before him, the ledger leaf, the doctored certificate, the blackened dish, and addressed himself not to the schemers, but to the still auburn-haired woman in the frayed unbleached muslin, who stood with the unlearnable posture of the highborn in the middle of the floor, where they had set her to be examined like a specimen. "Lady Rosalind Hawkmere," he said, and his pomp had gone out of him, and left only a plain old man doing his office. "This commission was convened to determine the soundness of your mind. It has done so. I find no madness here but what was poured into you by the spoonful. I find you of sound mind, of clear understanding, and grievously wronged, and I restore you before this county to your name, your person, and your inheritance as the sole and rightful heir of Hawkmere, and I tell you, ma'am, that in 30 years upon the bench I have not been gladder to be put right." There was a sound in the hall then, a low swelling murmur that broke into something like a cheer at the back, where the lesser folk stood, and Nan Pryor's voice rang out clear and unservant-like above it. "I told you she weren't mad, the lot of you," and for once no one hushed her. Rosalind inclined her head. That was all. She did not weep, she did not crumple with relief, she did not grovel her gratitude. She inclined her head with the grave economy of a woman receiving what had always, simply, been hers, and ought never to have been taken, and the dignity of that small motion did more to convict Drusilla than any speech could. The commission's officers came for Drusilla then. 2 grave men in dark coats, moving to either side of the bottle-green silk, and Sir Hubert ordered her taken into custody upon the charge of conspiracy to falsely confine and to poison, and Coyle bound over to answer for his own part, and the 2 of them were led from the great hall through the same wide doors by which the county had filed in to gape at mad Rosalind. Drusilla white and rigid and silent at last, Coyle stumbling and sniveling and clutching his ledger like a child with a guilty toy. As Drusilla passed her, the 2 women's eyes met for the space of a single breath, and Rosalind, who had imagined this moment 10,000 times in the dark of the barred east bedchamber, found she had nothing to say to her at all. She only looked, and let herself be looked at, sane and upright and free, and let that be the whole of the answer, and it was Drusilla who looked away first, and was gone. And then there was Edmund, Lord Edmund Hawkmere, her brother, who had sat through all of it grey and shrunken in his chair, half blind for 2 years to the thing his wife was doing under his own roof, and now made to see the whole of it at once, came to her across the emptying floor, and went down on one knee to his sister on the cold flags of their father's great hall. "I let them," he said, and his face was wet and ruined. Rosalind, I let them take you for mad because it was easier than to think my own wife, because I was a coward, and grieving, and I shut my eyes, and let them carry you off down that cliff road, and told myself it was a mercy. There is no forgiveness in it. I do not ask it, I only— His voice failed him entirely. She looked down at the crown of her brother's bowed head. The brother guilty not of malice but of the small daily cowardice that lets malice flourish, and she did not raise him up with a saint's easy pardon, nor strike him down. "Get up, Edmund," she said, in the low exact voice that had counted 2 years of days, neither warm nor cruel. "Hawkmere men do not kneel in this hall. Get up and be sorry standing, where the work of being sorry is harder and counts for more." It was not forgiveness, it was a door left ajar, which was more than he had any right to, and he understood it as such, and he got up. Through the whole of it Adrian Vauncey had stood by the long windows where the grey cliff light came in, and he had not once taken his eyes from her. Now, with the hall thinning and the lark box closed again on the table, and her name restored to her, he crossed the floor to her, and he did not come as her physician. "They told me you broke it off," he said, low, for her alone, though he stopped a courteous arm's length away as though afraid of his own right to come nearer. 2 years I believed you had grown tired of me, because no letter came and the word that reached me was that you would not see me. I mourned you living. I never knew she burned them. If I had known one word of one letter I would have come, I would have torn the door off that cliff house with my hands." His voice was not steady. The cool-handed mad doctor whose name could commit a soul to an asylum was not steady at all. "I know," she said. And she found, to her own faint astonishment, that she did know it, wholly, that the abandonment she had grieved alone in the dark had never been one at all, only another of Drusilla's quiet thefts, a man's faith stolen to go with her lands and her mind. "You did not leave me, Adrian, you were stolen, like the letters, like the years." She let him see her face, unguarded, for the first time in 2 years before any living soul, and her cold beautiful hands, when she put them out to him, did not shake. He took them in his, those chilled hands he had read the poison in, and warmed them between his own. And before the last witnesses of the county and her ruined brother and the wide-eyed kitchen girl, and gentle deranged Mrs. Verrall, whom Nan had brought down from Saltmere into the light to see her friend made free, Mrs. Verrall, who clutched the door frame and said to no one, in one of her clear hours, "Her eyes are home, I always said so," he said, "Then, let me ask you in the open, where no one can steal it, what I should have been let ask you years ago. Not as your doctor. As the man who never once stopped loving you. Marry me, Rosalind, on honest terms. Equal terms. Not because I rescued you, God knows you rescued yourself, you only wanted to be heard, but because I would be glad past all saying to spend my life beside a woman who could be wronged so far and lose nothing of herself." She did not answer at once. She had let the quiet do her work for 2 long years, and the quiet had freed her. But this once, with her name restored and her gaolers led from the hall, she let herself be quick. "Yes," she said. "Not because you asked it well, though you did. Because you asked it of me, and not for me. And I had begun to think no one ever would again." And that was the whole of her grand reply, and it was enough, and his hands tightened on hers. And behind them, Nan made a sound that was half a sob and half a whoop, and was promptly, gloriously, not hushed. Later, when the county had filed out chastened by the back doors they had swept in through, when Mrs. Verrall had been settled gently into a warm parlor, that would be her home now for the rest of her clouded days, kept by Rosalind's own hand, and never again by a barred door. Rosalind walked back to the commission table where the rosewood lark box still lay. Beside it, where some clerk had set it down among the evidence, and forgotten it, lay the spoon, the small dull pewter spoon Coyle had filled night after night with the grey tonic, and pressed to her lips, while she let a thread of it run into her sleeve and swallowed nothing. She looked at it lying discarded among the damning papers, and she did not touch it, she left it where it lay, the way you leave a thing that has no more power over you. And she took up instead the lark box, the betrothal gift, the keeper of her secret, and turned the little key in its side with her own cold beautiful hand. The first time in 2 years that any hand but a gaoler's had given her anything, and it was her own, and emptied now of its proof, the box did the only thing it had ever truly been for, and it sang. The lark's song spilled bright and thin into the great hall where they had brought her to be declared mad, the small, clear, unbearable tune climbing and falling. And Rosalind Hawkmere listened to it play by her own choosing, and Adrian stood beside her, and did not speak, and let the song be the whole of what was said. They will tell you, the world keeps its madhouses for the broken, the lost, the raving, the ones whose eyes are not home. But it keeps them just as often for the inconvenient, the woman who owns too much, and protests too little. The heir worth more declared mad than left in her right mind. Rosalind Hawkmere was never mad a day in her life. She was only sane in a house that needed her not to be, and her great revenge was not the ruin of the people who poisoned her, but that she walked out of that hall exactly the woman she had walked into it, unbroken, unhurried, and entirely her own. So tell me, if they had handed you the spoon every night and sworn to the whole county that you were the one who had lost your mind, how long could you have stayed quiet, and counted the days and waited? Tell me, in the comments. And if you believe the world is far too quick to call a woman mad for the crime of being in someone's way, subscribe and stay with me. Because the next soul they tried to bury is already winding her own music box, and her song is only just beginning.